Welcome to Nineworks TV. Now I've got something very special for you today. I'm on a rooftop, a pretty blustery rooftop here at Porsche Centre Bournemouth, one of only 5 classic partners here in the UK for Porsche. And the reason I'm here is to take a look at this car. Now what you're looking at there, this silver car over my left shoulder, is Porsche Turbo Genesis. That famous turbo moniker started right here with the 930 3-litre car way back in 1974. Now over the 50 years since, that turbo moniker and supercar has evolved substantially. And what we're going to be doing today is looking at that turbo moniker, well, for the entirety of the air-cooled generation. Now it's worth pointing out from the start that the 911 Turbo wasn't the first production sports car to go turbocharged. That accolade goes to the 2002 BMW Turbo of 1973. But Porsche had been experimenting with turbochargers with success in the Can-Am race series with its 917 sports cars. And it was CEO of the time, Ernst Fuhrmann, the guy who incidentally would go on to try and kill the 911 in favour of the transaxle cars by the end of the 70s, who wanted to meld Porsche's success with turbocharging on its race cars with the 911 sports car in order to create a new halo road model. And the answer was this, the 930 3-litre turbo. The first turbo was actually a homologation car. Porsche needed to build 200 of these to take the 911 racing for Group 3. It was this 911 that paved the way for a pretty spectacular legacy of turbocharged racing 911s at Porsche. Think that golden age of 934, 934.5 and 935s, as well of course as privateer efforts such as Creamer's K3s and K4s. Only 200 required to be built for homologation. Porsche would build comfortably more than 10 times that. Let's dive into its story. Here we are there. Welcome to the start of the 911 legend with the 911 Turbo or 930 3-litre. The 911 Turbo was actually revealed at the 1973 Frankfurt Motor Show, and the theme of that was the automobile into the future. Now Porsche's only real indication of the future, from the inside at least, was given away with just 2 factors, to be honest. Number one is ahead of me when you look at the 911's 5 iconic dials. In the middle VDO clock, which of course is the tachometer, at the bottom there was a boost gauge. The second one is down by my left knee with the gear shifter, because instead of there being the usual Type 915 or 915 5-speed gearbox, the 930 Turbo had a 4-speed 930 specific shifter. Otherwise, I mean, there are so many giveaways on the exterior of this car that differentiate this of course from the narrow-bodied Carrera. The first giveaway being, and I've just mentioned it there, is body type. The 930 Turbo went wide-bodied. Porsche reason with more power you obviously need more grip. Therefore the 15-inch Fuchs were widened by 1 inch front and the rear, from 6 and 7 to 7 inches on the front, 8 inches on the rear. Now to accommodate those wider Fuchs wheels, you need wider arches, and so Porsche integrated some steel arches that sit a lot wider and basically mean the rump of the 930 Turbo is 6.4 inches wider than what we now know as the narrow-bodied Carrera equivalents from 1974. Then if I look out the interior mirror, you can see beyond the bottom of the rear screen you've got that lovely whale tail protruding out with its rubber lip, and the reason it had a rubber lip is for pedestrian safety. It's worth pointing out that when Porsche revealed the 930 Turbo in 1973 at the Frankfurt Motor Show, the car itself was actually a model. It had a 2.7 litre engine in the back that Porsche said would put out around about 280 horsepower, but the turbocharger itself was fake. It was made out of wood and mocked up so that customers could see what the car would look like, but actually it was a naturally aspirated 2.7 litre car. That specific car was turbocharged in the end. It remained a 2.7 litre. It's the only 2.7 litre 911 Turbo in the world, and it was given to Louise Piech for her 70th birthday. The production 930, as here, is of course 3 litres, putting out 260 horsepower, 343 newton metres of torque, made over 4 production years, 1974 to 1977 inclusive. There were 2,850 of those cars made for worldwide markets, including the US. They were of course banned later on, but we'll get to that later in the video. Of the 2,850, only 74 were right-hand drive. None in the first production year, 74. 75 and 76 had 40 cars made for this market over those 2 years, and for the final year of 930 3-litre production, 34 cars came to the UK. So that means 74 overall of 2,850. A rare beast indeed. And this car is a resplendent example of the genre. Anyway, enough of me waxing lyrical about numbers. Let's start the 930 3 litres turbocharged engine so we can hear it catch. Oh, it's so funny how the steering wheel is pretty much in my lap. What you have to remember with the 911 Turbo is back in the day this car was spaceship wide, far wider than anything else on the road. But even today, and I followed this car in prior to the test, the stance and presence on the car is unbelievable. It's so wide, just proportionally the way it sits, and it kind of really has sculpted that 911 Turbo silhouette or appearance since. Low, squat, wide, extremely purposeful and aggressive. Why 4-speed then when the naturally aspirated 911 at the time had a 5-speed? Well, simply put, Porsche didn't think the Type 915 gearbox could take the torque of the 930. So a 930 specific 4-speed gearbox was created. It really is a quirky part of the 930's arsenal. There's no getting away from the fact the 930 Turbo has a real Jekyll and Hyde character about it. At low revs, when that single turbocharger is sleeping, it's a very docile machine. However, awaken that turbo and it really does turn into a rip-roaring machine. And it's in that interim period where you can get caught out. If the boost comes in on a corner, for example, obviously it's rear-wheel drive and absolutely we're years away from any sort of driver aids. It's no wonder plenty of people got caught out with this car. Therefore, to drive these cars, and particularly to drive these cars fast, is a bit of an art. It's all about keeping the revs high, which is why in these 4-speed cars you need to resist the urge to change up too soon. As it is, I'm in third gear at the moment at 40 mile an hour, sitting at just over 2,000 RPM. Put my foot down, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, boost. Two hands on the steering wheel. So funny, you get past 4,000 RPM and that boost gauge at the bottom of the tacho is asleep until 4 and it just goes. You can see why people would get caught out in this thing, there's no question of that. Not helped by the fact that the brakes aren't the best and I'm really having to lean quite heavily on them there. There's a real delay to that influx of thrust as the car reaches its maximum torque of 343 Newton meters, maximum power of 260 horsepower, a full 60 more than the naturally aspirated Carrera of the time. I mean, that is a sizable jump in power, particularly in an era where all power increases, of course, were purely mechanical. So we talk about the challenges of driving the early 930 and the art of managing everything. Well, another aspect of that is weight distribution. We know the 911 is unfairly skewed weight-wise towards the rear anyway, that's where the engine is. The 930 Turbo, of course, has even more weight in the rear over naturally aspirated equivalents because of the turbocharger and associated componentry, and also, again, you know, wider wheels, wider steel arches, all puts more and more weight towards the rear of the car. You can feel the weight transfer under hard acceleration. Car kind of tips back onto its hind legs. So those constantly changing parameters of grip are perhaps more exacerbated by the 911 Turbo over, say, naturally aspirated equivalents. More weight, more torque, increased weight transfer. Something else to deal with, get used to. I'll tell you what though, what an absolute privilege it is to be driving something so iconic. A car that's very nearly 50 years old. A car that started Porsche's turbo legacy. It's so rich. I don't know, does it get any better than this? But of course the 911 Turbo story did evolve from this point, and the 930 designation itself would evolve quite substantially right up until 1989. It's at this point where the 930 story evolves quite substantially, and it also gets quite complicated, so bear with. To all intents and purposes, this Guards red car that you see here looks very similar, if not identical, to that 1977 turbo over there, the silver car. However, there are quite a lot of differences if you know what you're looking for. The original 930 turbo has a 3-litre car producing 260 horsepower. For 1978 model year, capacity was up thanks to a larger bore and stroke to 3.3 litres. We'll also notice there's a different wing. It's the easiest thing to spot between the two cars. So gone is what we refer to as the whale tail on the 3-litre. In its place for the 3.3 litre era is this, affectionately known by enthusiasts as the T-tray. Now the biggest difference here is in this side lip profile. You'll notice over the whale tail, this section here, this side profile of the rubber lip is much thicker. Now the reason these side flanks have been redesigned and affectionately bolstered is because Porsche engineers wanted to stabilise the car at top speed. Now incidentally, the top speed on the 933 litre is 155. This is 161 mile an hour. So we're kind of pushing the limits a little bit more here, and that's why top end stability is ever more key. Now the other key difference to this wing, which is a bit of a giveaway as to technology behind the power boost on the 3.3 over the 3, can be found underneath. You'll notice that here there's a much thicker section that's plainly not there on the 3-litre, and the reason is this. Ta-da! The intercooler. Now this is the first intercooler ever to feature on a production road car. This played a big part not only in the evolution of the 930 from 3-litre to 3.3, but for the rest of the turbo story right up to the present day. Running this single intercooler along with a couple of other detailed changes to the engine allowed the 930's power maximum to be raised to 300 from 260, as well as an extra 69 newton meters of torque. This was a key development for not only Porsche but road cars generally. But as you can see, here's where the 911 comes down at its flanks. There's simply no room in this small engine bay to house the intercooler. So Porsche's engineers came up with a pretty novel idea of simply creating more space in here, which is why the T-tray was thus redesigned. Cementing its position at the top of the 911 tree, the 911 Turbo, as the ultimate super sports car, pretty much had everything as standard. It really was as luxurious as you could get in a Porsche 911 of the time. 1978, which was the start of the 3.3 litre era of 930, up to 1989, was a period of steady and gradual evolution of the 930 Turbo. Year on year, steady improvements made the car a bit more refined compared to the early cars, which could be described as perhaps a little bit agricultural. For example, the 3.3 litre car got brakes from the 917 race car, offering better performance and better cooling. They were housed in 16-inch Fuchs, up an inch in diameter from the 15-inch on the 3-litre car. Electric mirrors on both sides, air conditioning and a radio. The headlight washers at the front, the snorkels on the original replaced for more flush items. A Bosch K-Jet system was used from 1983. The boost was rerouted through a silencer which gave better torque and MPG from 1983. A new DME Motronic computer was used on the car from 1986, boosting MPG. Then from 1987, the 930 Turbo Coupe was joined by Cabriolet and very rare Target equivalents. And for 1989, the last year of production, the 4-speed gearbox was swapped out for a 5-speed. And those cars are particularly sought after by collectors today. They're available for one model year only. It's worth pointing out that these cars unfortunately were banned in the US and Canada from 1981 to 1986 due to emissions regulations. For the next chapter of this video, I want to go back to 1983 though, to a pretty cool period of 930 history that involves the Sonderwunsch department. Does it get any cooler than this? I love sports cars from the 1980s. It's my favourite era for the automobile, and nothing screams opulence and decadence and just outright outrageousness quite like a flatnose 911, the Flachbau 930. I've previously done a video covering the history of the Flachbau 911. I'll pop a link here so you can take a look. But this was a rather eclectic, some might say inspired choice for the hardened enthusiast to go for. As you can see from the other turbos along this lineup, the look detracts rather significantly from the traditional 911 aesthetic at the front, with its upright headlights at the end of those long gun barrel fenders. The flatnose was inspired, of course, by the 935 race cars at the time, those successful Group 4 race cars that I mentioned earlier on at the start of the video. And essentially, if you're a well-heeled customer, in return for some open wallet surgery, you could have your own race car look for the street. And the result is this, the Flachbau 930. option code M505. These were done at the factory from 1983. It's worth pointing out that other third-party coach builders could give you a 911 flat nose look. The replacement body panels on those tended to be made of fiberglass and were of course inferior quality to these steel items from the factory. This particular car was optioned as M505 from the factory. It has a pretty cool history. I love the fact it's a cab as well. It's the perfect 930 spec for me. Proper Miami vibes, flat nose cabriolet. It's not quite Miami here on a cold January day in Dorset, but we're going to get the roof down and go out and experience some 80s decadence. It's a funny one really with the 930 slant nose. You either get it or you just don't. Some people, purists, just love that quintessential 911 look. So again, if you're a purist, the idea of a flat nose 911, it's almost sacrilege. I, however, love the look. To me, it just underlines the magic of what the 80s was all about. That opulence and ostentatiousness and outrageousness that went with that decade, the decade of the yuppie. To me, the 930 Flachbau personifies everything about that period and the culture behind it. So what did the M505 Flachbau product code get you on your 930? Well, it got you a revised front bumper, including a new spoiler. The front bumper incidentally housed a central oil cooler. It got you those thicker side skirts that led to air intakes ahead of the rear wheels. Obviously the pop-up headlights with louvers above the front wheels. As for the engine itself, well, it got you a boost in power from 300 to 330 horsepower. Which feels as thus. These turbos are so much more of an event to drive and to push them in comparison to today's turbos, for example. The 933 litre, far more agricultural in the way it puts down the power, lots and lots and lots of lag, and then, I say a whack from behind, but compared to today's cars, it's not really anything to write home about. This car, towards the end of 930 production, has gone from 260 horsepower to, with the power kit, 330. And so the shove up the road is A, more pronounced, but also it just builds more, whereas the 933 litre is very kind of on-off. The 3.3 with the power kit builds that power quite nicely before building to the almighty whack from behind. It doesn't really make the car any less predictable, it has to be said, and certainly you don't want to be putting your foot down mid-corner with the boost coming on, but it's far more kind of sophisticated and polished in the way it executes its power over those early 930s. Also worth mentioning the seats. Now, if you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know I go on about seats a lot because it's crucial. It's where you park your backside and you spend all your time as a driver in these thrones. I mentioned earlier on the 933 litre, the steering wheel was right in my lap, but in these sports seats, you're positioned a lot lower down, which is nice from a driving point of view. These seats are really comfortable as well, and they've got amazing lateral hold thanks to these thick side bolsters on the seats. Again, as I say, 930 era, constant evolution. That is the 930 story, and indeed the end of part one. Coming up in part two, the turbo story evolves for the 964 and 993 generation.